Welcome, everybody, to the 22 Latinx KidLit Book Festival. Woo! We're so excited to be here with you today. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please read our anti-harassment policy in the chat box. And don't forget to subscribe to the Latinx KidLit Book Festival YouTube channel so you can check out all our amazing panels. Finally, if you are a school, classroom, librarian, or educator joining us today, please enter our classroom book set giveaway. We have some amazing books in our giveaway this year, super exciting. You can find the link to the entry form in the chat. So with that said, let's get going. My name is Karla Arenas Valenti. I am the author of Loteria, a magical realism middle grade adventure that takes place in Oaxaca City, Mexico. The book features life and death playing a high-stakes game of loteria where a girl's life hangs in the balance. But this is also a book about free will versus fate, whether we have the power to choose our destiny or if everything is predetermined. And I'm joined today by 5 wonderful authors that do middle grade and YA literature. I will give them a chance to introduce themselves to you and talk a little bit about their books. So we'll go ahead and launch it with Guadalupe.
Hello, my name is Guadalupe Garcia McCall, and I am the author of The Keeper. And The Keeper is the story of James Anthony, who is moving to Oregon from all the way down in Texas. And he is very unhappy and a little surly about it. In fact, so surly that he's playing all kinds of tricks, pranks on his little sister. And she's not having it just like that. She's playing them back. So there's a prank war in our midst. And when he gets to Oregon, he thinks it's the worst decision his parents ever made. But his parents love this idyllic, beautiful, perfect home in this perfect community. Well, it's perfect until James starts getting mysterious letters, haunting letters, scary, creepy letters that say they are from the Keeper and they're looking for young blood.
That's so creepy.
Sorry, I was ordering that book off of that description. Hi, everybody. My name is Julian Randall. I'm the author of Pilar Ramirez and the Escape from Zaffa. Just want to make sure it's not on my bump. So it is your classic tale of a 12-year-old Black Dominicana aspiring documentary filmmaker who gets sucked through a page into another world. Okay, I guess it's not like that common, but Pilar is a aspiring documentary filmmaker. She's been putting together a documentary on her cousin, Natasha, who disappeared during the Trujillato that dominated the Dominican Republic for 31 years back from 1931 to 1960, right? So she has been interviewing her mommy, she's been interviewing her abuela because Natasha just disappeared one day. But as is often the case, she doesn't really get a whole lot out of her mommy and her abuela on this. So she goes to interview this professor. Goes there, dude's not there. All that's in there is a bunch of folders, papers, and in there a folder and paper with her cousin's exact name and date of disappearance on it that sucks her to another world where she finds that the Dominican boogeyman was in cahoots with Trujillo the entire time, and they've had her cousin. So she has to find her power, find her history, and find her way back home.
That's a great summary, by the way. Find your power, find your history, and find your way back home. I love that.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laekan Zea Kemp, and I am the author of, this is my debut middle grade novel, Omega Morales and the Legend of La Lechuza, and it is a contemporary fantasy novel about a girl who must learn to trust her ancestral powers when she comes face to face with the Mexican legend La Lechuza.
I love it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rex Ogle. I'm here to talk about my second book in a series called The Supernatural Society. This one is called Curse of the Werewolves. Essentially, it's about a boy, Will Hunter, who moves to a small town and very quickly learns that only he and 2 of his friends can see the monsters, mythology, magic, and mad science that exist in his town. And it's up to them to in the first book, they battle vampires. In the second one, they'll be going after werewolves. So it's up to them to save their town.
So I read Laekan's book first, and it was really interesting because it was so creepy, and it had like there were parts in the book where I was getting really nervous and scared, and then all the other books that I read had that same theme. So they actually trigger one of our questions that I'm going to ask you guys all later. But because Laekan was the first book that I read that had it, that question came from your book, and fortunately all the other books also fed into it. But great books that we have on our panel today. It was such a delight to read them. I hope all of our viewers will read them as well. Reach out to these authors, tell them you love them. And to give you a sneak peek, what I've asked our authors to do is to read a first few paragraphs of their new book. And here's why. Something that stood out in each of these books, and I'm not kidding, was the immediate hook. From the very first page, I was drawn into each of your stories. That is really, really hard to do. And so when it's done well, we want to share it. And so I was hoping you could each just read a page or a couple paragraphs to set the tone. And then just talk to us a little bit about how you built that hook. Was that always going to be your first introduction to the book? What made you decide to pull the reader in the way that you did? Guadalupe, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I'm going to read the first two paragraphs. Chapter 1. The darkness comes upon us so quickly, I just know it's a sign. This move across the country to Brentville, Oregon is all wrong for us. I can feel it deep down in the pit of my stomach. Leaving Texas was a big mistake. Selling our little house in Somerset was a mistake too, because now we don't have a place to go back to. But the biggest mistake was moving all the way up here to a state known for having the largest fungus in America. Honestly, who brags about that? Not that I could have stopped it. I'm only 12 years old. Wherever my parents go, I have to go with them, fungus or no fungus. It's going to rain, I say, peering at the darkening sky. It always rains out here. We'll be wet and miserable for the rest of our lives. And so how do I pick voice? Honestly, the characters have to be really unique and interesting for me to go there, to stop doing what I'm doing in my normal life. Like I might be washing dishes, I might be teaching a class, and there's a little movie reel going on in my head, and a new character pops in and they start talking and narrating, and if they say something so intriguing, or if their voice itself is so funny or quirky or moody, or in this case a little sardonic, a little sarcastic, I fall in love with them, and then I absolutely know that I have a good book and that I have a character that intrigues me and might intrigue others.
And for those first paragraphs, right? That hook, that voice is so powerful. So did you, when you sat down to write for the first time, did you write those two paragraphs, or were those at the end, or how, because that is your first introduction to the book?
It usually starts that way. If other characters come and the story's they're not that intriguing, I kind of just go on with my life. But when something like that happens, when James showed up, I was like, well, that's interesting. Yeah. And that's so funny about the fungus, right? And it was because earlier I had read something about fungus earlier in the week. And so it's intriguing, it's funny, and it's smart in a way. And I want to write it. I want to follow his story. And that's how my novels start. And usually it is the first thing they say.
All right, cool. I think that I'm up next. Chapter 1. I'm paid to believe in what I can see. Okay, I don't actually get paid, pero it's the principle of the thing, ¿entiendes? Anyway, all I'm trying to say is that I'm mad observant. It's kind of my thing. Pero that place I saw last week was nuts. Straight tonteria, you feel me? I was just trying to finish my movie, inform the masses, maybe score some extra credit to start off the 8th grade, pero now everything is upside down. And I mean that last part, literally. Wait, I'm doing that thing I hate in other people's films, starting in the middle. So let's rewind and run the whole thing back. It was all good just a week ago. I woke up in my usual bed in the house with yellow walls and a blue fence on Tom and Apple. I'm saying blue fence because it's been passably CTA blue my whole life, but it hasn't ever been all the way blue. Ever since I can remember, we've lived here behind this chain link fence with peeling paint that mommy always means to repaint, but never actually does. Even when I was super little, it had tiny nicks and cuts in it from where mi hermana, Lorena, would jump over it to ride bikes down the block, or from the dents we made playing baseball. All my life, through this fence, I've been watching people from the block ride down the street. People like our neighbor Manuel driving by between his gigs playing guitar with a bachata band and his job making light bulbs at the local factory. According to mommy, our family and Manuel must be the only Dominicans in all of Chicago. Lorena learned, most folks here are Latinx. That's the gender neutral version Lorena learned in college. I like the word, and it's pretty easy to say once you get the hang of it. But most people here are Mexican or Puerto Rican, like my best friend Celeste. And that reminds me, my name is Pilar Violeta Ramirez. That's Pilar. Say it right or don't say it at all. ¿Entiendes? For 12 straight years, everybody and their mom, even their cousins, have been mispronouncing my name. And as a result, the vice principal of my grammar school told mommy I have patience issues, which is slander. I'm super patient. A good director has to be. I'm just not patient with people who think my family would ever name a little Dominican girl Pillar and send her out into the world. Okay, when I say it that way, it doesn't make any sense, right?
I mean, look, voice. That just screams voice, right? You hear it in your head, you know immediately, you read that, you know immediately who you're dealing with.
Right.
Yeah, that's my little sister. Yeah, no, she just popped into like that. Those were the first words that she ever said to me. Like my agent had asked me if I would ever be interested in doing like a middle grade kind of Dominican American fantasy. And I was like, well, what would the question that I would build that novel around be? And then once I have the question, I try to think what character would have that question. And then Pilar walked in and was like, I'm Pilar, I'm gonna take it from here. And I was like, cool. She's been tap dancing on my last nerd ever since.
Well, and what I love about this for all of our students that might be watching or people who are breaking into the writing world is that sometimes these characters do walk into your life. Sometimes you don't have to force them. You just have to listen, or you have to hear your little sister, right? And a lot of it is just being open to watching and listening to the people and the situations around you. So much of storytelling isn't creating the story, but finding the person that's going to tell you, your main character, and creating a space for them to tell you the story. So Laekan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yours? Why don't you read a couple pages or paragraphs?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this is from chapter 1. The trees are talking to me again. Mommy tells me it's because I'm too willing to listen. My cousin Carlitos tells me it's because I don't practice controlling my empathic abilities enough. But I think it's because I'm cursed. It's not the trees' fault they're so chatty. You try standing in one place for hundreds of years without anyone to talk to, collecting memories since you were just a tiny seed. The moment you finally have an audience, it makes sense that you'd want to put on a good show. Excuse me, one of the pecan trees lining the park path tosses an unripened shell at me. But are you trying to say we're making this all up? Did I mention trees can also read minds? At least the ones in Noche Buena can. And that's not even the strangest thing about this place, which is why our family has been practicing magic here for centuries. On this little patch of dirt where horny toads grant wishes, cats have way more than 9 lives, and the ghosts are more obnoxious than the living.
I love that line.
For me, the first chapter is always the part of the story that I rewrite the most. So as I learn new things about the characters and the world and the plot, I'm constantly going back and changing things and rewriting it and just making sure that that opening sort of packs the right punch, and making sure that it's engaging, that it'll pique the reader's curiosity while also grounding them in the world. And I think that's especially important when you're writing fantasy. So just in those first few chapters I read, or first few paragraphs that I read, we already learned that, you know, Omega comes from a magical family, but she's struggling a little bit with her abilities. She might even be cursed. And then we learned that the trees can talk and read minds, and that talking to them is sort of just a normal occurrence in the town where Omega lives. And so I think the reader is immediately drawn in by questions of, is Omega cursed? What exactly can our family do? How are the trees able to speak and read minds? What are they trying to communicate? And then I think most importantly, what other magic exists in this place? So I think a good opening gets the reader asking those kinds of questions, and it definitely takes me dozens of revisions to get it to that point.
Well, and I think you raise an excellent point, and I want to emphasize that because so much of the hook is the question, right? You're presenting a question, and you're giving the reader a promise. If you stick with me and read through the end of the book, I will answer that question for you. And so, if a story doesn't start with that question, you're losing an opportunity to grab that reader and really pull them in. And the question doesn't have to be stated as one, but it just presents enough, like you said, right? Hey, who is this person that has some magic, but not to the extent that she expects it, and lives in a world where trees talk, but is maybe cursed? And those questions are exactly the thing that makes you want to turn the page and the next one and the next one. At least that's what happened with me, and I'm sure all of our listeners feel the same way. Rex, what about you? Why don't you launch us into your book?
Okay. Chapter 1, Under a Full Moon. Will's life was over. No, he wasn't dead. Not yet. But it felt like everything was ending, and that feeling threatened to overwhelm him. Of course, that's what happens when you find out you've been bitten by a werewolf. Dear reader, I am getting ahead of myself, aren't I? You need some setup for our story to begin. Apologies, let me clear my throat of phlegm and spiders. Then I'll start over. Ew, those weren't spiders in my throats. Those were maggots. So yeah, I have a narrator in the Supernatural Society who narrates the books. He is completely outside the story, and he is a monster himself. So he's got some experience with monsters, and he kind of brings our characters through the story, and he knows everything. So he's a very fun character. He's laced with a lot of darkness, which just sets the tone for the rest of the book.
Well, and I think it's interesting when you have a narrator like this that is in and of themselves a character of the story, because you're dealing with multiple powerful voices, right? Your narrator's voice has to be distinctive and stand out, but also each of your characters has their own distinctive voice and personality. And so to build the story like that gives the narrator the space as a personality on their own, but also doesn't necessarily overshadow your main characters. That's pretty talented. That makes for really, really fun and engaging reading. Did you always know you wanted to have a narrator like that, or did that come as you were writing? Because your narrator came in the first book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Honestly, it was like from page 1, I knew that there was going to be a narrator. I came up with the idea for Supernatural Society like 20 years ago, and I had just come off reading Lemony Snicket's Series of Unfortunate Events. And so I was like, I want to do this, but I want to do this with a monster.
Brilliant. And that's a good segue to our next question, but I'm going to pause right here to showcase something else that's really good for students and people who are learning the craft. He said 20 years ago is when he started coming up with this idea. Some of these stories take a really, really, really long time. And that's what makes them so wonderful, because we spend so much time thinking about them and rewriting them. And like, as Laekan said, sometimes you rewrite your first chapter a million times. So this is a craft. It's an art. It takes time, and it requires a great deal of patience. So for anybody out there who's struggling and feels like they're not making a whole lot of progress, you are in good company with our fellow panelists today. And since you brought up monsters, Rex, I'm going to lead into our next question, which is that each of your books in different ways are dealing with monsters of some sort or another. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the kind of monster that's in your story. What made you decide to write a story about that monster? Or if you want, what made you come up with the idea for that story?
I'll go ahead and get started, and I'll tell you that my monster's name, I don't want to give too much away, so I'm going to just continue to call him the Keeper. And the Keeper came from a story that was actually on the news, that this community, this family went into a community, they bought a house, and soon after buying the house in New Jersey, they started receiving these threatening letters telling them to get out, and the house was not really theirs, and just really, really creepy stuff. And this went on for a long time, and I don't think they ever resolved that case, but it was a case and it was on the news. And so I just kept thinking, what would that look like from a child's point of view? And what if the letters were not for the parents, but were for the child? And why wouldn't the parents be involved in this? Well, maybe they're pranksters, and the parents think this is one big giant prank that they're playing on each other. And so just the story kind of snowballed from there. But the concept of this keeper as being someone that belongs to a community where they were lured into this community, and that this community has decided that they're going to use the powers of the natural world around them to make their lives prosperous and long. And so it's that kind of concept of when somebody welcomes you into a community and you don't know that they do not have your best interest in mind. So it is a cautionary tale, but it's also a tale about how do you build community when you walk into a space like that.
Well, and it also like highlights that monsters can be fictional, but they can also be a place or a feeling, right? Sometimes the monster is the tension that we feel or the animus that we might feel from the people where we are.
Right.
And so these monsters take on, it can be abstract, it can be really concrete. And I think in your case, that is it, right? Sometimes our monsters are ourselves. And so I think it's really, whenever we're looking for an antagonist, it comes in many guises. And
Right.
I think your book is a really good example of that.
Thank you. And of course, I don't want to give away who the keeper is, because it is actually a person, but they do find out that there's magic and fantastical elements that are being drawn from the natural world, which is kind of scary when you think about our environmental issues.
Sure, yeah. Julian, tell us about your monster.
All right. The monster at the heart, right, is El Cuco, who is the Dominican boogeyman. He steals away like misbehaving children in the night. Generally, is like averse to sunlight, kind of like just kind of werewolf-esque in a way, right? But the reason that I chose him and that he felt like the natural like foil to Pilar in a way is that El Cuco is essentially just Trujillo, but like with like even worse grooming somehow, some way. Okay, Trujillo, when he ran the island, like, people disappeared all the time, like basically adults, women and children. Like, it didn't really matter. Like, everything runs around this guy who, without any like kind of recourse, can just snatch up a member of your family. Right. So it made sense that the two of them would be homies, especially when we think about like how, Dominicans we're naturally very like superstitious people. We exaggerate all the time. And as a result of that, the supernatural is just so much a part of like how we move through the world. And I think it's part of what makes Latinx fantasy, makes Latinx mythology, is the idea of like whose hands are guiding you along through the world, even if you cannot see them. And that goes for monsters as much as angels.
So for me, I think all good fantasy, there's always like the literal monster, but then there's also the metaphorical monster. And in my book, the literal monster is revealed right in the title, La Lechuza, who is a witch with the ability to transform herself into an owl. This was the monster from Mexican and Chicano folklore that I grew up hearing the most about. My great-grandmother actually claimed to have seen her. And so I used those stories about her haunting deserted highways and draining car batteries and luring people in with a hypnotic whistle. And I sort of re-envisioned her with a much richer backstory so that we could learn about the woman that she was before she became La Lechuza. And then the metaphorical monster in the story is definitely the fear of the unknown, which I think is at the root of so much, hate and divisiveness in our world today. So I think Omega coming to terms with the fact that things aren't always black and white and that people can be monsters too is an incredibly timely lesson that kids Omega's age are also coming to terms with. And so I'm really glad that they'll be able to go on this journey alongside her and hopefully come out on the other side a little bit more prepared to handle the gray and to face the real monsters when they see them.
So I love that you said that people can be monsters too, because I think you laid it out perfectly for Rex to tell us about his monsters.
So I have a lot of monsters in my book. The town is filled with all kinds of creatures. I grew up watching the Universal monster movies, the black and white ones from the 50s and 60s, maybe even earlier than that. But, you know, Dracula, the Wolfman, the Invisible Man, the Thing from the Black Lagoon. Like, these were movies that I loved. My abuela did not like me watching them, but for me, they were wonderful. They took me into another world. And as I got older, I learned about La Lechuza and El Cuckoo and Chupacabras. Like, these were things that I grew up loving. And so I wanted to make sure that my book had all of them. So everyone makes a guest appearance.
And I want to bring back something that Laekan, you said about not being black and white. And I think that's really important when we talk about monsters, because it's very easy to think of monsters as just the epitome of all evil. And in some cases they are. I think Julian's book, you really have some all evil monsters. But monsters are not always all bad. And sometimes it's really nuanced. And what we think is a monster might just be another backstory that we didn't know about. Laekan, like in your book with La Lechuza, she presents as a horrible monster, but in the end, you realize that she has a backstory that maybe explains a lot and maybe mitigates some of that monstrous quality that she had. And so it really drives the reader to dig more deeply into our own assumptions and our own expectations of monsters and villains and antagonists, but also the good guys, right? Because we're human, we're complex. These things are not always resolved in the extremes. It's a grayscale. And I think you guys all did a really nice job in your books of presenting that. So one of you brought up fantasy, actually a couple of you brought up fantasy. So let's talk a little bit about fantasy. The theme of our panel, of course, is celebrating Latinx fantasy. So I would love to hear your general thoughts on what that means. What is Latinx fantasy? How is that different from just other kinds of fantasy? And in what ways does your storytelling or your particular book reflect Latinx fantasy?
Well, I think that Latinx fantasy for me is showcases our folk tales, our cultural cucuys, right? All the cucuys. Because where I'm come from, everything was a cucuy. Everything that scared you, somebody would yell, cucuy, because you don't know what it is. And so it just gives you that flavor of who we are and how we look at the world, how we explore fear in our world. And so, like in some of the mariposas, which was more fantasy even than this one, I had all the cucuys. I had lechuzas, nahuales, and brujas, and all kinds of things in that one. And it was, and chupacabras too. But it was really important for me to showcase the humanity in these characters. La Llorona was in there, and she told her story and retold it in different, and gave you a whole new perspective of what had happened that night when her children died. And I think that's really important, to not just give the cucuys, but also try to give the backstory and try to have readers empathize and learn empathy. In this one, I'll go ahead and give it away. They are brujos. They are wizards and witches. And so the keeper, is the leader. So the whole novel is about trying to find out what would make them use the natural resources like that, harvest from the earth to use it for themselves, to, in a way, abuse nature. And so also abuse nature, not just the environment, but also the people in the environment. And so I think it's really important for us as Latinx people to talk about these things, to talk about community. What does family mean? But also, what are we afraid of? And what are we trying to illuminate in the world?
I really love that answer. Yes, I outlined a good amount of this in my previous answer, but I think for me, Latinx fantasy is about the question of like what counts as magic and answering that with our own words, right? Like for me, the first Latinx magic that I ever saw was my mother speaking Spanish to her sisters on the other side of the country, my mom would say something in a language that I didn't quite understand yet, and her sister felt better miles away. That was magic to me, right? When I think about like in Pilar, she meets these four galipotes who are responsible for the entire city of Minerva. And each of them has the name and like appearance of one of the real life Mirabal sisters who led the resistance against the Trujillato. That's magic. And so I wanted them to be in a space where where that magic could be honored, and I knew that they could not be like harmed or killed in the ways that some folks like try to do to us. So it's really for me about like what counts as magic and learning to fear or celebrate that in equal measure.
And living with that magic, right? It isn't something that's separate or distinct from our everyday. It's part and parcel of who we are and how we live, whether it's a myth or witnessing that connection that is magical. It's real magic. It's not brooms and cauldrons. I mean, sometimes it is, but it's something that's woven into our visceral self in a way.
For me personally, ideas for fantasy stories usually come grounded in some kind of cultural practice or myth. As we've been discussing with Omega, obviously it's grounded in Mexican and Chicano folklore, but I mean, it could be anything culture specific. So many of us have grown up with knowledge of rituals, or like we've been talking about superstitions, or just an air of something supernatural. We're a very open culture. Like, we're very open to the notion that there are forces working in the universe and that energy and intentions have power. And so it feels like a very natural leap to go from living in and writing about a world that we already believe is sort of magical to writing about a fantasy world where that magic is just more explicit. And so I feel like whatever ways Latinx authors choose to explore that are valid and beautiful.
For me, I just remember, I fell in love with horror movies, but at the same time, I was learning about my own culture, about, my grandmother. My aunt noted one time that my grandmother was her mother was a curandero. And I was like, what's that? She's like, it's a healer. And I was like, so it's like a witch. And then they were like, oh no, brujos are much more scary. Those are darker. And I was like, but why do they have to be dark? So in my book, I also, explore that monsters don't have just one side, but that they can be anything. They can be good, they can be bad, they can be a mix.
Yeah, that's great. And this is actually a great way to lead us into student questions. So our wonderful Latinx KidLit Book Festival team reached out to students all across the country and asked them to submit questions to you guys. So now we get to hear from some of our students, and we will let our team put up the first question for us.
What inspired you to write books?
Isn't that the $1 million question, right?
My students. I was a teacher in middle school for many, many years. I don't want to say how many because that would give my age away, but it was definitely wanting for them to see themselves on the page. I wanted to tell their stories and share their experiences, their quirkiness, their funny moments, their sad moments, their challenges, their difficulties, but also their triumphs. So definitely my Hispanic Latino students.
In the spirit of book that took 20 years to write, or 20 years to come to culmination, the first time that I ever saw my mother cry, it was because she was reading In the Time of the Butterflies by Julia Alvarez. And that is the real life story of the Mirabal sisters who led the fight against Trujillo, right? But the way that she phrased it to me was, this is the story of the women who fought back against the man who kicked your abuelo off the island. Because 50 plus years ago, my abuelo, when he was a young man, had made a joke about Trujillo amongst his friends. And it had gotten back to the secret police, and they'd started coming around the neighborhood, coming to snatch him up. And he ended up making it out in time. They didn't catch him, but if they had, just like that, no more us. And so I'm always like so interested in like these alternate worlds, these alternate fantasies, that like each of the worlds that we make was not necessarily made out of like grand strokes of magic, but a million tiny strokes of magic making one grand world. So I want to tweak and mess with that.
That was a really beautiful story. I feel like I've been telling stories since I was a toddler. There are so many home movies of me in diapers, like while talking into an old phone that my mom had unplugged. And I would just talk into it for hours to absolutely no one, like barely making any sense. And my imagination just has always been, really strong. And I grew up as an only child. So telling myself stories and playing make believe was just how I always entertained myself. And combining that with my love of reading, it just felt really natural to tell stories. But like Guadalupe, the reason I write for this particular age category is because I was also a teacher, and I was an ESL teacher for 5 years, and I taught 9th and 10th graders, mostly from Central and South America. And I just, I love creating characters that share aspects of me and my family, and friends that share aspects of them and their families. And I just feel it's so important to write stories for them where they can see themselves, where I can see myself, my family and friends can see themselves. So I've always been a storyteller, but sort of the motivation behind it has definitely changed and evolved as I've gotten older and just, seen how great the need is for these types of stories.
I was an only child for the first 10 years of my life. And I too was very much, I love to create my own stories. I love to play with my action figures and make up my own stories about why He-Man was in the Star Wars universe. And so were the G.I. Joes. But my abuela was always taking me to the library, and I was always reading books. But what I found was that there weren't any brown boys reflected in the books. And so I knew that as I got older, I wanted to write more stories about brown boys like myself, just so that I could see myself in the book and so that other kids could see themselves in my books as well.
And this is a good time to shout out to librarians. We love you so much for this very reason. You put those books in the hands of the readers who need to see them, and our storytellers, of course, who write them. So yay to everybody. All right, let's see. I think we have a couple more questions if we can get those up.
My question is, how come on the first revision, editor always makes like 100 changes?
Yes, great question.
Because my vision of the story is a limited vision. But when I share my story with somebody else, they bring their imagination into it. Just like when you read the book, you read so much more than what I put into it, what my editor put into it. And even though we changed a lot, it changes when you read it, and it changes when your friends read it. And it changes every time someone reads it. So a story is always brand new.
Yeah, it's also, I love that. I love that. I think that it is also a question of just like audacity, right? Like the idea of when I come in, I want to make the story, and I've thought about it. I've thought about it so much that like certain rules in my head, I forget that I'm the one who made them up. And then Brian will be like, why is this way? And I'm like, well, if I made it this other way, then America would invade the portal. And he's like, well, I feel like if you don't write America invading the portal, you probably good, fam. And that allows me to like make those changes and make those revisions into like the book that you end up hopefully enjoying. So it's always good to have somebody else to be there to be like, nah, go bigger.
Well, and that point, right? The go bigger, because that's so good. Sometimes we've built this story and somebody else sees a broader vision, and they have the tools and the ability to guide us and gently take us to tell the story that it can be, even if we didn't see that that's the story. We started with the baby story. So I like that go bigger concept.
So luckily, I've never gotten an editorial letter that had like quite that many changes in it or requests for changes. I mean, I'm sure over the course of revisions, I do end up making that many changes to the story. But as everyone has said, in the end, it's actually a really good thing for the story to grow and change so that by the end, it's the best version it can possibly be. And when we're working with our editors, it's a lot like, you students, you English students working with your teachers. Like when you turn in an assignment and they give you feedback to help you make it better, It's all in service to the story and just making it the best it can be.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like a lot of students probably have teachers that go in with the red pen and mark it up, and it's hard. It's hard to see that, but at the end of the day, they're trying to make you stronger, and that's what an editor does. Is, I'm not a natural born writer. I've had to work really, 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 really hard. I've been rejected thousands and thousands of times. No joke. I've been writing for 20 years, and the first like 19, it was just rejections across the board. So I'm not a natural born writer, but an editor's job is to make me look like I am. So my hats off to editors.
That's awesome. And again, here we see, I mean, becoming really good at your craft takes time. It takes people. It takes being open to hearing, getting editorial comments, to having other people reading it and chiming in. You guys are all saying the right things to inspire our burgeoning writers and storytellers. And we have one more question for you guys to answer. So, do you write the whole book before coming up with an idea, or does the idea come up as you write it? Guadalupe.
Well, as Karla knows, I plot the whole thing. So there's this thing, a pantser or a plotter. A pantser sits at the desk and starts with that little tiny thing, that little spark, and they just kind of roll with it. They don't know where the story is going. I know where the story is going. It takes me a couple of weeks and sometimes less to plot everything, the whole thing, like 17 single space pages of chapter by chapter synopsis. Once I have that, I sit down and I can write the novel. And it goes so much faster this way. I've tried it the other way. That took a long time. So for me, I plot. I brainstorm.
Also a fellow plotter over here for sure. Though I think for me, it's kind of like playing jazz. Like I like to think of like the outline that I'm doing is like making sure that like, okay, we're always going to have some percussion, right? We're always going to have like something like keeping the beat. But like what makes it special is when somebody comes in, they're like, oh man, like they're blowing into this glass jar. And this other person's like dinging on this other person dinging on the pot. So it's about, for me, like creating a structure where I'm like, okay, everybody's inside the house. What music we play is up to us, but we must understand that at some point we're moving to the other end of the house.
So I'm what you would call a headlights writer, which means that I know a little bit about the story before I start, but not all of it. So I usually know about 3 chapters at a time. I'll plot out those 3 chapters, write them, and then I'll imagine, the next 3 chapters, and then I'll write those. And so while I'm writing that first draft, I'm making those important discoveries about the characters and the plot and basically letting those characters tell me the story first. And then once I have all of the pieces, the important pieces, character, plot, any twists that I'm going to incorporate, then I go back and I rewrite the entire story to make it stronger. But I definitely don't know the whole story before I start.
Which then actually makes sense because, as you explained earlier, when you're revising your first opening paragraphs and your hook, you need to be able to know the whole story. Once you've gone through it, you can then go back and say, oh, now I know some key things that I didn't know at the beginning. Then let's tighten this up. That's a great technique.
Yeah, I've done both where I start with just an idea and I just let my keyboard go wild with my fingers. But I actually find that outlining is the best way to go because it's just so important for me to have like the skeleton of a story laid out so I know where I'm going. And then oftentimes the story will start to write itself as I'm going. And sometimes I stray from the outline and it's a beautiful thing.
So I have to say, I call that the magic of writing because once it starts expanding, that universe just gets beautifully, beautifully built during that time. Then I'm changing my outline as I go. I never go back though, because my job is to get that first draft done in 30 days. And once I do that, but I love the expanding. Yeah.
Well, and I love the trying different things, right? So like you said, you've tried plotting, you've tried pantsing, the headlight writing. And so we don't always know what kind of a writer we are or even what the story needs. Sometimes we tell the story using pantsing techniques, and other times it requires plotting. So there's some degree of flexibility required in being able to be honest and tell the story that you want to tell. So I think we're coming up at the end of this amazing 22 Latinx KidLit Festival panel. I guess if there's a final word that you guys want to share with our readers, or if you want to tell them how to get in touch with you, I will ask all of our readers and librarians and educators and teachers and anybody watching, show your love for these authors. They've worked really hard, 20 years to get you these books. So show your love, go support these wonderful authors. And let's close it out. We'll start with Guadalupe and get us all the way to Rex.
Well, I want to say the message I have for everyone is believe. Just believe and work towards that hope and that dream that you believe in, that is uniquely you. You can find me on Facebook with Guadalupe Garcia McCall. You can find me on Twitter at Gigi McCall, and also at Instagram at Gigi McCall. And my website, gigimccall.com.
Well, I just wanted to say everybody here is so wonderful, and y'all are enough. Our magic is everywhere. It is in grand strides and it is in tiny spheres. If you want to follow along and know about the release of Pilar's paperback and also the sequel, which is coming out February 28th, it's Pilar's first trip to the island. My handle is down below. It's at Julian the Poet, and that also has the link to all of my websites and means by which to get in contact with me. I will always answer any question from a student, any question. I might not answer it immediately, but I will answer.
And I also want to mention that Omega is going to get a sequel. It'll come out next year, and it'll pick up right where the first book leaves off, and it'll focus on another monster from Mexican and Chicano folklore. And if you want to connect with me online, I am at Laekan Zea Kemp on all social media platforms, and then laekanzeakemp.com is my website.
Supernatural Society #2 is out. Supernatural Society #3 comes out sometime early next year. I'm very excited for that. I also have a graphic novel called Doña Quixote, which is very much a Latinx story, and I'm very excited for that to come out. You can find me at rexogle.com or on Instagram at thirdrex.
And I'm Karla Arenas Valenti, author of Loteria. If you would like to learn more about me or my books, please visit karlavalenti.com. I'm also at KV Writes on Twitter. And I want to close out with one final huge shout out and thank you to the Latinx KidLit Book Festival Committee. They have worked so hard this year to put this festival together. So a big round of applause to all of our friends. And we hope you'll stick around and watch some of the other panels. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I was inspired to write the Sombrero Trials because I grew up loving books like The Hunger Games and especially Percy Jackson. I love these really huge, vast worlds with a lot of really cool world building included. And I always wanted to be like a secret demigod like in Percy Jackson. But when I read those books, I could never see myself reflected in the story. So when I decided to write the Sombrero Trials, I wanted to come up with a whole new pantheon of gods that were inspired and honoring my Mexican culture. So that was a lot of fun, honestly, and the world building was really difficult. I had to learn about creation myths and what pantheons are and how they represent a culture. And it was so much fun. I had such a good time writing it. I was also really inspired by my favorite shonen animes that had tournament style episodes and arcs. Specifically, I think we can all agree that My Hero Academia is incredible, and that was definitely a huge inspiration for the trials. My favorite character is definitely Mia. She is Teo's best friend, and she is a daughter of Tierra, so that means she is the daughter of the god of earth and mountains, and she has really cool powers. She can take any sort of earth, metal, or stone and turn it into whatever weapon she wants. I also really love her because she is this huge 6'5", beefy herbo girl who has the heart of gold, who is maybe a little clueless sometimes, but like deeply loves Teo and is like full, like the best friend you could ask for. The Sunbearer Trials, I think, is perfect for anyone who loves fantasy, anyone who loves, like I said, shonen tournament anime, the Hunger Games, but a little softer, Percy Jackson, but make it Mexican. And I think it's really for everybody. It has a really diverse cast. There's both black and brown characters, and there's so many queer characters. Even the omniscient sun god who oversees the entire world of Reino del Sol is a non-binary, and out of the 10 competitors, 4 of them are under the trans umbrella, and there's different sexualities that are represented. So it's really just like a love letter to like the queer community, but also like my Mexican heritage. So yeah, I'm really excited for everyone to read it. It was such a pleasure to write, and yeah, I hope you guys like it.